Well, what we're going to do now is to discuss some of the basic characteristics of the institutions of the European Union, and in particular, the extent to which the European Union, the institutions, are intergovernmental or supranational. And we're going to have a discussion about this. It's going to be a kind of a spontaneous discussion. But what you might like to do before we begin is to think through what are the, let's say, 3 aspects of the European Union that you think are decidedly intergovernmental. So please feel free to pause the video at this point and write down 3 respects in which the EU is intergovernmental. Well, let's begin. What do you think is one of the most important or key aspects of intergovernmentalism in the EU?
Well, I would say for me, one of the more fundamental aspects is that the foundation, the legal foundation, it remains the treaties. Right? There have been attempts to shift from instead of having treaties as a base for European integration, for European Union, to go to a proper constitution, right? And there again, Churchill's visionary statement of the 1940s of having a United States of Europe, the idea was to have like the United States has a constitution, to have a European constitution. And the European Union came closest to that in the early 2000s, when there was actually a draft for a treaty that was going to be called, maybe some thought, a constitution. Right, and we talked about that when we were talking about the 5 key treaties. That effort just went nowhere because it ran into opposition. The first significant wave, probably, well, actually second significant wave of Euroscepticism, with 2 referendums, one in France and one in the Netherlands, that decisively said, no, this is not going to work. And then out of that...
That's interesting, because that wasn't intergovernmental, that was actually populist. It had nothing to do...
Yes.
With the governments, it was really the people's mobilized, the political mobilization of citizens. But I do agree. I think the treaties.
But it was trying to move away from that treaty base, right?
Yeah.
Which didn't work. So the treaty base is still very much.
The treaty base is still there, and I agree. I think the treaties, in a sense, they empower the national governments because they require the consent of every national government that is involved. And so, you know, the treaties are the kind of the symbol and also the reality of member state control. That doesn't mean that the effect of the treaties is intergovernmental. You know, you can make an agreement among individuals who each of whom have unanimous control towards something that is consortial, towards something that's supranational. So I think the treaties, the fact that they must be ratified by national governments, you know, that is perhaps the most intergovernmental, the basis, the intergovernmental point of departure for the European Union.
So what would be your second then, if we agree that that's kind of maybe the most fundamental?
I think the fact that when we get to an exceptional crisis situation where you need some real reform, institutional reform, and that has to go outside of the existing structure. So, for example, in the economic crisis, it was clear that 1% or just over 1% in the budget was not going to handle the crisis that arose after 2008. And so you had to have major economic subventions, major economic resources to deal with the crisis, and the sense that the banks were so fragile that they could collapse, and you needed a serious liquidity, and the liquidity had to be provided by national governments. Could they be provided by the national governments acting individually? Well, at first they were, but it became clear that some of those national governments, in particular in Greece, and then in the southern countries,
and also Ireland.
And also Ireland. they needed support.
Yes.
And that had to happen outside of the European institution.
And
So it was the national governments that
Right.
took the prime role there.
And the support was essential, because the eurozone itself, and therefore the European Union, was at stake, right? If these governments were to go under, then the eurozone would go under, and so it was in order to preempt that fiasco, really, that the other governments had to come on board, whether they liked it or not.
Yeah, and then the argument there, or one of the arguments there is look, it began, the EFSF was the first move, about half a trillion liquidity, 500 billion, and that was the first step. That was a corporation under Luxembourg law. It wasn't part of the European Union. And then the ESF was an international, that followed up with about 700 billion liquidity. That was an international organisation under Luxembourg law. So it all took place outside of the EU. It was led, motivated by national governments. But what I think one can see is the routinization of this inside the European Union, and then it starts to get part and parcel of the European Union rules, and then you get circumstances in which there is not unanimity, where the member states can decide jointly by qualified majority. And I think that's a decisive break, because whenever you have a situation in which an individual government is compelled to do something it wouldn't otherwise want to do, that is a shift towards supranationalism. So where you lose the veto, you have a move towards supranationalism. And so as a policy gets routinized within the EU setup, so I think it's then subject to supranationalism.
But there's still a number of policies, and I guess that would be done my next kind of intergovernmental element still there. There's a number of policies that remain under the unanimity or consensus rule, and they're becoming increasingly exceptional policies, but they're there. I mean, obviously there's the major decisions, we talked about that, like treaty change, but also accession, right? Or for those policies that are not written in the treaty and that for some reason present themselves, issues that present themselves, and new policy collaboration has to be invented, then that needs to be agreed upon by the member states collectively, and typically by unanimity, right?
Yes, indeed. And you have to make way for some exceptions.
Yes.
So this is the possibility that in a foreign policy, you can actually have a subset of member states that go ahead. They have to go ahead under qualified majority, so they can be constrained. But I think it's 9 or more member states.
I think, yes, it's 9. And once you have that critical mass, the procedure is called enhanced cooperation. You can go, those 9 or 9 plus can go ahead and it's usually areas in what we sometimes call core sovereignty powers, right? It is areas with respect to criminal law or civil law, so something that's very close to judicial system, foreign policy, as you mentioned, defense, some areas in taxation. So those would be also police cooperation, these types of things. Those would be the areas where if 9 member states do want to go ahead, despite the fact that some others don't want to, they will be allowed to do so, right? So, and that's a way of kind of maintaining the fiction of national sovereignty, while at the same time enabling cooperation among the willing.
Yes, it's kind of finessing the veto.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges in the European Union is precisely to finesse the veto. Because if you imagine a polity which is composed, let's say, of 15 or even as many as 27 units, each of whom has the veto, I mean, what are you going to get done?
Lowest common denominator.
It's the lowest yes, you'd expect very little to be agreed. So, but you know, the bulk of legislation, maybe I'm moving to supranationalism, but the bulk of what happens in the EU under the normal decision making, and that is under qualified decision making. So what else would be intergovernmental, do you think?
Well, and some of you might have thought of that because we talked about it when we were talking about the institutions. I mean, it remains a fact that it's the national member states that kind of have a hold on who is going to occupy the senior positions, the senior positions in the Commission, in the court, in the bank. And then, of course, in the European Council itself.
But again, where it's qualified majority,
yes,
a big state like the UK
yes,
can get, defeated in terms of who is going to be the president of the council.
Which they were.
Which they were indeed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly, and the same. So when Donald Tusk, the president for the European Council, came up for renewal. That was in 2016, I believe. He's Polish. His government, which was the opposition party, fiercely opposed it, but was unable to stop it. Right.
Yeah.
So these are just not only theoretical possibilities; these things happen, and it shows the limits to national sovereignty.
So then, look. So even when we're talking about intergovernmentalism, it's not black and white. It's a kind of a grey. And so what one might say from a kind of a black and white perspective, I don't think it works, but what one might say is, well, in the end, a state can leave. They can exit.
Yes.
In the end, you have national sovereignty.
Well, we had a brave state that is experimenting with that one.
Yes. And you have you have control to put yourself in a very weak position vis-a-vis bargaining. I mean, even getting out of the European Union, it's not a matter of simply walking out the door and saying goodbye. I'm now a free soul, and I can, as a state, can determine my own existence and the conditions of my existence. What you are essentially saying is, I'm going to be getting out. I'm going to need to negotiate my way out, and in that negotiation, I'm going to have to deal with a much larger partner, or actually adversary.
Yes.
And so the reclaiming of national sovereignty, what Brexit has shown, is that the reclaiming of national sovereignty is a very complex business in which the state that wishes to reclaim its national sovereignty does not have the dominant hand, but is engaged in an ongoing process of negotiation. And when that will end with Brexit, no one knows. It'll be, I think, ongoing for ever and a day.
It kind of reminds you of why we have the European integration in the first place, to achieve scale. And so even in Britain, which is the second largest, or was the second largest country of the European Union, even such a relatively not small country, I don't want to say large country, feels the icy winds for,
but one Liesbet with delusions of grandeur.
Yes, delusions. That
we could do it, we Brits. We are going to, put our mailed fist down on the table. Yes. It didn't quite work that way.
Shrink and realize that bargaining in the big world as a much reduced kind of scale is very difficult.
Yes, I mean, I think you put your finger on the pulse, really. Because what is the choice for a state even as large a middle range state like the UK? Either it can exist under the illusion of national sovereignty in a world of big players, where it's got to deal with the United States, China, and the European Union above all.
Yeah.
Where it thinks that it is nationally sovereign, but what can it achieve in terms of power relations with these larger bodies? Or you operate in the context of a larger body in which you can have much more control of your external environment, but you have to make concessions and agreements within that. And so there is no kind of golden bullet. It really is a choice. And so you can well imagine that a small group can believe that they have total control over themselves and their decisions, but it's you have control in the context of an environment. And that is where scale makes a difference. If you have large scale, you have greater control in your environment. So that is that's some of our thoughts about intergovernmentalism. And let's now turn to supranationalism.
So, now it's your turn. Okay, on supranationalism.
Yes.
What you think? What is perhaps for you the top supranational feature?
Well, I think it would have to be the European Parliament for me, and that is the fact that you now have a co-decision maker. It's called co-decision maker, with veto rights over almost everything except major changes. Accession, treaty reform, the major changes. So almost everything, 80% we said of legislation. And this is not a government institution. It's a government institution in the broad sense of politics and government, but it's not a national government. It's not the executives of the member states that are controlling this. And so the Parliament is a popular body elected by Europeans. Sure, the constituencies are individual countries, just like in the United States, the constituencies are the states or constituencies within states. But it's a popularly elected body. It's a supranational body. And the way in which the Parliament is organised internally is up to the Parliament. It's not treatified. It's not, the member states don't say, this is the way you're going to organise putting forward new legislation within the Parliament. That's self-contained. It happens kind of in the cracks between the treaties, so to speak. And so I think the Parliament would be right up there. And the fact that the Parliament has continually extended its authority in the context of Europe and really feels, that it represents the popular will of Europe and has that kind of chutzpah, that kind of legitimacy, I think is important.
It's interesting because apparently the Parliament was an afterthought in the original European coal and steel community design, right?
Yeah.
Jean Monnet hadn't thought that a Parliament was necessary, really, and then some reminded him that this really ought to happen because, after all, there is the people's voice, there is the commitment to democracy.
And calling it the European Parliament was actually, later on, it was quite controversial. It was really designed. It initially started as being those who sat there were actually people who sat in their national parliaments.
Correct.
And so it wasn't popular. The popular election only came in after '79.
Right.
And so I think that's, really that's the kind of the core of supranationalism. But what would you say alongside that? What would be the?
I would probably point to the European Commission, which. And again, I refer to Jean Monnet, which Jean Monnet intended to be the engine of European integration. And many Commission officials, people working there, still think of themselves as the engines or the true guardians of European integration. When Jean Monnet conceived of the project as needing a vanguard European elite, people who would chart out, who would think strategically and chart out what was needed in order to essentially overcome national strife, right? National rivalries and strife. And over those 70 years, obviously the European Commission now looks much more like an ordinary administration, civil service. That your typical job there is of drafting legislation or following up on the implementation of legislation or drafting regulations that implement parts of that legislation and so forth. But there's still, up till today, and I'm not meaning only among the College of Commissioners, but actually in the civil service itself, a kind of a sense that these are the true guardians, the people who are truly kind of able and live a life above the individualities of the national states and have to think about the whole picture.
Yes, and maybe the heyday of that was in the days of Jacques Delors.
I think it was.
And the Single European Act
80s,
and then the
90s.
movement to monetary union, and there's been this kind of routinization, really, of the European Commission. But look at the way that it's set up, and that you have an independent administration that operates alongside or in the context of the College of Commissioners. And these are, we know these people, and they really are. They think of themselves as Europeans,
Yeah.
by and large. They're not all supranationalists. Liesbet's research actually goes very deeply into that, and because Liesbet has interviewed these people at the top of the administration, something like 150 such individuals, it's clear that they're not just blanket supranationalists. Many of them are, but they're diverse. They're diverse individuals.
They clearly are.
Yeah.
They clearly are. And, because this administration is actually very small in numbers, you're talking about 26,000 policymakers, and I'm not counting the translators. If I add the translators and the secretaries, I'll come at 34,000. Okay, policymakers. And these are kind of high-level policymakers.
They have enormous responsibilities.
Yes.
I mean, I was once talking to a kind of a young man who had quite recently moved into the Commission, who had responsibility of the regional funds, the cohesion funds, for all of Portugal.
Yes.
I mean, they have very broad responsibilities because the administration is so small.
Yes.
I mean, there are more people who work for the state of North Carolina in Raleigh than there are work for Europe in Brussels. And so it really is still a kind of a line, and to get in there is very similar to getting into the State Department in the United States. A series of exams, very stringent. A lot of the people who go there have PhDs. So I think that the Commission is a real supranational institution, despite the fact that it's the member states that propose. It's the members of the college.
So the college is the political component, and that is, that's more a kind of a hybrid.
It is a hybrid.
A hybrid part of the Commission, and is also intended to be that way because, as we said before, these are the kind of the linchpins a bit between the national political and social sensibilities, and then what is needed at the European level, how to create or meld that into a more European-wide policy.
Yeah, but they wouldn't turn around and say, I am the French representative, I represent France in the European Commission.
They couldn't speak.
They wouldn't. That's not how it works.
In the country that I know best, seems to apparently is that in the way that they sometimes say, the country that I know best. So.
Yes, so that they could say.
Yeah.
But that's really using their experience and to lever that in a different situation.
Yes, yes. So, okay, Commission, Parliament.
Then you'd have to say the ECJ, I think.
Yeah.
That is European law, the status of European law.
Yeah.
And we've talked about direct effect and supremacy, and that the European legal order is the legal order which envelops and constrains national laws. So there really is a European legal order with a European Court of Justice. That I think you'd have to describe all of that as supranational. Now you can get tensions. You think of a potential tension between a country that has a constitution and the ECJ and European law. And one way this came to a head in Germany, and the way out of this were two cases which are called Solange 1 und 2. And what this means is this: Solange means so long. So long as there is no direct conflict between the Bundesverfassungsgericht, the German basic law, the German constitution, and the European constitution, we accept the supremacy of European law. Now, when Supreme Courts, and the ECJ is no exception, take up cases, they're very aware of the political environment. These are political animals. It doesn't mean they're intergovernmental, but they're political animals. And so where there would be real conflicts, and there haven't really been such, between the national constitution of a major state like Germany and the basic kind of constitution of the European Union, people would tread very carefully.
Yes, which is probably, if you think of it, also something the Supreme Court in our country needs to do. Right?
Yes, indeed, dealing with states and states' rights.
Yes.
And there's always this contretemps there's always this tension or potential tension between states' rights and
Yes.
and the federal order in this country, and Europe is no exception to that.
With I think a major difference, we've mentioned it before, that the European treaties do not explicitly mention supremacy of EU law, right?
Yes.
So this is something that has been established through precedents, and therefore perhaps doesn't have that same kind of rock solid basis as the US federal system
Yes,
has.
and in the European Constitution, the constitutional treaty that was defeated, it would have had
It would have had
that formal supremacy in black and white in a treaty
Yes.
form, in a
Yes.
constitutional form. Yeah.
Yeah.
So okay, we're moving along here. There's several important institutions or elements. What do you think we've forgotten? Or
I think, well, there's the European Central Bank, which is clearly an institution that was designed to be independent, both from the political bodies at the EU level and from the national governments and even the national central banks, right? The national central banks are part of it, but they are enveloped within the European Central Bank. And it's actually also the one institution where the top layer, the executive board, is not simply, it doesn't have 27 members. That is, not every national central governor is there. It's just, these are people who are full-time appointed to serve this European Central Bank, and then underneath them is a body, a governor's council, where all the national central bank governors are convened and regularly get informed and can weigh in on decision making, but the actual decision making is very much in the executive board, the 8-member people, and the president right now is Christine Lagarde.
and then you get pressures. There's the national banks are still in existence. They're scaled down.
Sometimes
But the
there's
Bundesbank is still there.
sometimes a little bit of kind of back and forth
There's
between
back and
the
forth with
German central bank and the European Central
Yes,
Bank.
in terms of QE2, the policy of actually for the bank buying national debt. So these, there are controversies in here.
Yeah.
But I totally agree. I think it's, the bank is set up as a supranational institution.
Yeah.
So let's think what remains on the table. I think something important does remain on the table.
I think so, right?
And that is qualified majority voting, even in the core intergovernmental institutions. Let's take the Council of Ministers. So where you get, the 55%, 65% rule, what it means is that there is consortial decision making. It means that on important matters, an individual national state does not control its own fate, the policies that have legal bite within the territory of that member state. So, we're thinking about two kind of ways in which supranationalism can take place. One is in terms of an institution like the Commission, which sets the agenda, which is so important in the European Union, by virtue of its monopoly of agenda setting. So that's one thing where you've got a separate institution, or like the bank. Yeah. The other is where, even among the member states, when they make decisions, there is not the member state veto. And that is a situation that, imagine a member state that was intent on preserving its national sovereignty. It would then not be able to make any consortial agreements that bind itself while it lacks the ability to veto. So the national veto is a key element in national sovereignty, and you don't get that on the bulk of legislation in the Council of Ministers.
It's about 80%, which is by qualified majority. Right.
So I think, so the situation we're painting is one of greys, of different shades of grey, rather than black and white.
Or rainbow colours.
Or rainbow colours. I'm not quite sure how I'd array the colours in that respect. Maybe blue would be supranationalism and red would be the national sovereignty. But it's interesting that these are shades, because generally speaking, the way that this is debated is that there are some academics and some practitioners who say we want state sovereignty, by which they mean ultimate state sovereignty, definite state sovereignty. And when you get into a situation of shades, one's talking about more or less. And I think the fundamental thing that one can take away is that national sovereignty is fundamentally compromised in the context of European Union institutions and decision making.
Indeed. So I think you have gotten a picture of where the European Union comes from, how it developed and how it works. And we now know the framework within which politics happens. So that's what we'll turn to next. We'll talk about some very basic issues that are contested within the European Union.